In the labyrinthine corridors of global affairs, Noam Chomsky stands as a vocal critic of America's role as the self-proclaimed champion of democracy. His argument isn't a rejection of democratic ideals per se, but rather a scathing indictment of the hypocrisy that often shrouds their application in U.S. foreign policy. Before we run the clip of Noam, here is a glimpse into his perspective. Chomsky argues that while the U.S. preaches democracy to the world, its actions tell a different story. He paints a picture of a foreign policy driven not by ideals, but by realpolitik, the cold, hard calculus of maintaining power and influence. In this game, strategic partnerships with authoritarian regimes trump the messy business of promoting democracy in countries deemed inconvenient or challenging. Chomsky points to U.S. support for repressive regimes in the Middle East, rich in oil and strategically located, as a prime example. He contends that democracy takes a backseat to securing geopolitical advantage and access to resources. Regimes that align with U.S. interests, no matter how undemocratic, find themselves showered with aid and military backing, while fledgling democracies challenging U.S. hegemony may face hostility and subversion.
The United States and its Western allies are assured to do whatever they can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. And there are very simple reasons for that. To understand why, it's only necessary to look at the studies of Arab opinion, which are conducted by the most prestigious U.S. polling agencies, released by major institutions like the Brookings Institution. They reveal that by overwhelming majorities, Arabs regard the U.S. and Israel as the major threats they face. In Egypt, the United States is regarded as the major threat by 90% of Egyptians. In the region generally, not much less than that. Some regard Iran as a threat, 10%. Opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that a majority believe that that security would be improved for the region if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, that's 80%. Other figures are similar. If public opinion were to influence policy, the United States would not only not control the region, but it would be expelled from it, Britain as well, along with its allies. That would undermine fundamental principles of global domination that have been operative in their current form since the Second World War, and as far as Britain's concerned, back long before that. In general, support for democracy is the province of ideologists and propagandists. In the real world, as the more serious scholarship has conceded, the U.S. and its allies support democracy if and only if it corresponds to strategic and economic objectives. Actually, Stalin could have said the same thing. Elite contempt for democracy was revealed very dramatically in the reaction to the recent WikiLeaks exposures. The ones that received the most attention with euphoric commentary were the cables that reported that Arabs support the U.S. stand on Iran, really important. The reference was reflexively to the ruling dictators. The attitudes of the public were unmentioned. The guiding principle behind this, apart from the obvious contempt for democracy on the part of the general intellectual community, the guiding principle was articulated quite clearly by a Carnegie Endowment Middle East specialist, Marwan Muasher. He's formerly a high official of the Jordanian dictatorship. The principle is, there's nothing wrong, everything is under control. In short, as long as the dictators support us, what else could matter? The Muasher doctrine is rational and venerable. To mention just one case that's highly relevant today, and in my opinion ought to be in the front pages, in 1958, President Eisenhower expressed an internal discussion, since declassified, he expressed concern about what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by governments, but by the people. The National Security Council explained at the same time the reasons for it. This is the highest planning body. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports dictatorships and blocks democracy and development, and that we do that so as to ensure control over the resources of the region. And furthermore, they went on to say that the perception is basically accurate, and that that's exactly what we should be doing, relying on the Muasher doctrine. As long as people are quiet, everything's under control, it's fine. After 9/11, there were internal government studies, U.S. government studies, which confirmed that the same is true. They responded to George W. Bush's plaintive plea that they hate our freedoms, and they concluded that no, they don't hate our freedoms, they hate our policies, and with good reason, the same reason they did in the 1950s. Actually, 1958 was a particularly interesting moment because that was just 2 years after Eisenhower had expelled Britain, France, and Israel from Egyptian territory, and not incidentally because he disapproved of the invasion, thought that was okay, but the timing was bad. It interfered with a U.S. planned coup in Syria, and he didn't like the disobedience. Britain, France, and Israel are supposed to understand who's boss, and not to carry out operations like this without informing the master. So they were summarily expelled. And you might have guessed that our public opinion would be favorable to the U.S. after this, but they perceive things a little more deeply than Western ideologists. So yes, there was a campaign of hatred for the reasons that the NSC, National Security Council, articulated. The current polls, which I mentioned, indicate that how little anything has changed in this regard, not at all, in fact.
Chomsky further critiques the double standards applied in judging good and bad democracies. He questions why the U.S. readily overlooks human rights abuses by certain allies while readily bombarding and intervening in countries deemed less friendly. This, he argues, exposes the selective nature of American concern for democracy, serving as a fig leaf for interventions driven by ulterior motives. Chomsky's critique extends beyond a simple Democrat good, authoritarian bad dichotomy. He recognizes the internal complexities of democracies, highlighting issues like wealth inequality, corporate influence, and curtailed civil liberties. He argues that promoting true democracy involves not just holding elections, but fostering an environment where power is more evenly distributed and citizens have a meaningful say in shaping their societies. Chomsky's critique is a clarion call for a critical reassessment of U.S. foreign policy. He urges us to look beyond the rhetoric of promoting democracy and examine the actions that contradict those ideals. Only then, he argues, can we begin to forge a foreign policy that aligns with the democratic values it claims to champion. I hope you like the video and give the channel a subscribe. Take care. Bye-bye.